So what do we have here? This is an A-style mandolin made by the Flatiron Company of Bozeman, Montana, sometime in the mid-1980s. I did a fret job on it a couple of years ago, and the owner has brought it back to me. He's wondering what we can do about this. Most of this wear was actually on the instrument when he got it. It served in, I think, a folk punk band for some years. And he's just concerned about the wear, and he wants to make sure that it's not going to deteriorate and basically seal it up a little bit to prevent changes in humidity and that kind of thing from affecting the wood. And I don't know if you can see it, but the spruce is essentially turned into a washboard. It's like corduroy. Some serious wear. So I told him the thing I would probably do is add a little bit of shellac, kind of like a French polish over that area, and not try to color match anything, just seal it up and sort of protect it a little bit. And he was alright with that, so I thought I'd make a little video about the ways in which I use shellac. If you go to any home center or hardware store, you'll probably see this on the shelf. This is the venerable Zinsser brand Bullseye Shellac, which is marketed mostly as a furniture finish and also a sealant for use under paints and that kind of thing, where you have knots or resinous woods that tend to bleed through an acrylic paint or a latex paint. Good for some things, but not good for instrument making. The main reason being that this stuff has a really short shelf life, and unless you know that it's fresh, what can happen is it'll go on the wood and it'll dry, but it won't fully harden. You'll end up with something that's always a little bit gummy. So I don't trust this for use on instruments. And instead, I buy my shellac dry in flake form. You can get this from any number of different woodworking suppliers. It's available in various colors. I prefer the blonde or the super blonde because that doesn't leave very much color on the wood, just imparts a slight amber tone. It's also available in either waxed or de-waxed varieties, and I like the de-waxed, mostly because it's a little bit harder and there's absolutely no chance that there's going to be a compatibility problem if I try to put another finish over top at some point. This stuff also has a bit of a shelf life, not so short as the stuff that's in solution. So I buy it and I use it within 2 years. It's important to keep it dry in a dark, cool place. This has these little silicate baggies in it to keep it dry. And when in doubt, always do a test sample before you actually commit to using it on your really expensive guitar, or in a repair for that matter. So as it comes, it looks kind of like plastic. It's quite crispy, sharp, little tiny flakes. And the way we mix this up is by adding alcohol to it. Now you can purchase methyl alcohol at the hardware store, methyl hydrate or meths if you're in the UK. Or you can buy extremely high quality and expensive lab grade ethanol, which in a lot of places is strictly regulated by law, so you don't end up making moonshine with it. But in certain places in the US you can buy it over the counter at liquor stores under brand names like I think Clearstream or Everclear in the sort of northwest part of the the US. So I use this stuff in a 2-pound cut, as it's called, which refers to 2 pounds of dry flake in 1 full gallon of alcohol. And of course, no one in their right mind would mix up a batch that big because you wouldn't have a chance to use it. I do mine in smaller doses and vary the proportions depending on the size. I like 200 milliliters of the ethyl alcohol, and I put in, I think, about 48 grams. I'm pretty careful about weighing it into that, which will give me the equivalent of a 2-pound cut. Mix it up and let it sit for at least a day, agitate it every once in a while. And you can see that I put a date on it, just to make sure I know when I made it. And if it's more than about 3 months old, I usually discard it and mix a fresh batch. It's not all that expensive. Some other things to keep in mind. I always use a glass jar to dissolve the shellac rather than plastic or metal, especially metal. Some metal plating can have a reaction with the shellac and ends up being cloudy and not very nice. So it helps if you use a quality pickle jar. Don't use the Walmart brand, or in this case the high quality pesto jar, and I decant it for use and sometimes thin it down with more alcohol depending on what I'm doing. But I'm just going to strain this using one of these inexpensive hardware store paint strainers. Shellac is a natural product that's made during the symbiotic relationship of a small bug in India or Southeast Asia and the resin in certain trees. Bug eats the stuff during a certain part of its life cycle and creates a little cocoon or a nest, much in the same way that a bee will produce a honeycomb using the beeswax. So they harvest that stuff, they heat it up and purify it, but depending on the quality of the shellac, sometimes there will be little bits of grit, dirt, insect parts, etc. in the shellac. Most of the high quality stuff has all that filtered out. Still, it never hurts to make sure you get rid of that so it doesn't end up in the finish and affect its clarity. Now this surface here has been open and exposed to sweat and various other elements for years, so it's a little bit dirty. I'm just using some alcohol as a degreasing formula to clean it a little bit, just to make sure there's not a whole lot of, or get rid of as much oil on the surface as I can. Using alcohol for this rather than naphtha or an oil-based product for obvious reasons. You don't want oil-based substances in the spruce. Good thing about alcohol is that it's a pretty good solvent and picks up the oil, but it also flashes off very quickly. This is going to dry out again in about 5 minutes. I don't know what kind of finish is on this instrument. It's possibly a nitrocellulose lacquer. In the 80s, they may have been using a catalyzed urethane, but I don't know. It's kind of a mid-level instrument. There's no binding on it, and the lacquer is kind of opaque. It's not very clear. So I'm just going to go over the whole surface here, the bare parts, and I don't know if you can see that, but there's some gunk coming off. Because shellac is alcohol-based, it dries very quickly. And I like to use it in very thin coats. The other thing about shellac is that it reamalgamates with itself. What happens is it'll actually take the surface that's already there, if there's shellac on it. The alcohol will remelt that previous coat of shellac, and the new stuff will go in and bond with it. So it becomes a continuous surface. The film is not like a whole bunch of layers. It's like one solid coat, but you can build it up with small amounts. I'm using a little paintbrush here just to work on the edges. This is the first coat. This will be a sealing coat. I'm not trying to overlap with the lacquer. I'm just trying to work up to it. Because it dries so fast, if I was working on a larger surface that had a heavy layer of shellac on it, you have to basically overlap your strokes and move really, really quickly, which is the whole technique of French polishing, which at some point I might make a video about if I have time. You can see that's darkening things a little bit. But this first coat is light enough that it's going to be pretty much matte. It won't add very much gloss. So I've got a couple of coats of shellac on now, and although color repair isn't part of the auspices of this particular job, I've got a couple of tiny little inconspicuous spots on the back here, so I thought I'd show you how I might work on that if the necessity arose. The nice thing about shellac being an alcohol-based product is I can use art markers. These are illustration markers that are also alcohol-based. This is Prismacolor, and I keep a number of different colors on hand for this sort of thing. For color matching, it's important to seal the wood first before I apply color over top. In case something goes wrong, I could always erase it by wiping it off with alcohol. But this will actually mix in with the shellac that's on the surface and provide a good color. Now this instrument has a pretty interesting kind of maroon toned reddish kind of cherry color to it. So I look at the finish and I try to pick out at least 3 different tones that are in there, and I will build up the color. It's rare that I'll have exactly the right color in my collection of markers, so this involves some blending. I know there's going to be red in there, so I'm using a cherry color. And then there's this is a light walnut, which will go in. It's also got some brownish tones in the original lacquer color, so I'll put a little bit of that on there. And this is a different brown. This is a cocoa brown, which will, it's almost a blue brown, which will take some of the kind of garishness of the red out. And by applying the colors in succession, I can end up with what amounts to a pretty good match. I'll let this dry for a few minutes and I can come right back over top with more shellac and do a drop repair. So I'm working on the 4th coat, which will probably be the final coat. Another nice thing about the shellac is that it's a pretty good adhesive. It'll wick in under the edges of the broken lacquer here and stick them down and make them a little bit less likely to flake off in the future. You can see I've got a bit of a gloss. It doesn't rival the gloss on the surrounding finish, but that's not what we're looking for. It's now sealed off, protected from moisture and dirt absorption and oils. And it also gives it a little bit of an abrasion resistance, so that if he's strumming hard, he won't inadvertently strum all the way through the top of his mandolin. That's it for today. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you again soon.